Judy Humbert was born in Winchester, Virginia, and is a member of the 1965 graduating class at Douglas High School. Humbert worked for 35 years for Rubbermaid Commercial Products and for 7 years for Southern Scrap. She is a member of Mount Carmel Baptist Church and serves in the Deaconess Ministry. She has been the chair of the Shepherd Staff Ministry. She has been active in the Black History Task Force, the Douglas Alumni Association, serving as secretary, and the Friends of the Hamlet Library. She was instrumental in creating the Winchester Black History Heritage Tour. She has served on the boards of the Boys and Girls Clubs, the City Lights Neighborhood Revitalization Program, the Frederick Douglass PTO, and the Winchester City Schools. She has been honored with the Peace and Justice Award from the Coalition for Racial Unity, the Ben Belchick Award from Preservation of Historic Winchester, the President's Award for Outstanding Service in Community History from Shenandoah University, and has received the Lewis Baker Award from the Winchester Frederick County Historical Society. Humbert was named a Northern Shenandoah Valley Legend in 2011. That's a wonderful resume. Local community service. I mean, I was stunned when I read all this. Please welcome Judy Humbert.
I'll just start off by saying, did I do all that? Thanks for having me today. A little bit about the book about Douglas School and how it got started. June Gaskins-Davis returned to Winchester after living in the Washington, D.C. area several years ago. She had boxes and boxes and boxes of photographs. She took them to the library, and I don't know how many of you know Becky Ebert, but Becky says, "Oh, Judy, we need to put some stories to these pictures." So that's how we got involved. Thought about how do we tell this story, because it's funny. No two people remember Douglas exactly the same. So Becky had a community service person come, and they just went through the old newspapers and every article connected to Douglas. They pulled, made copies for microfilm. And as they say, you cannot always believe what's in the paper. Well, the students from Douglas were reporters. So they wrote the articles, gave them to the paper published them. But when you ask, "Oh, I saw your name, you were a student reporter. Well, how did you get to be a student reporter?" "Well, I don't know, was I a student reporter?" So you just get all these stories. And so we tell the story from the perspective of the articles that were in the paper. The book is divided into, and here are some books, if anybody is interested in seeing them. So we talked about the beginning of education for Black children in Winchester. And it really started in like the 1860s. Dr. Nathan Cook Brackett came from Boston to help teach newly freed slaves to read, to write, and then he helped found Black churches in the area, and Mount Carmel is one of those. But the early schools were held in John Mahan Basement and Mount Carmel Basement. And then in 1871, the local school board started talking about education for Black children. Well, it was 7 years later, because they moved to the Piccadilly Street, the Old Stone Church right around the corner. That was 1878. It cost them $450 to get the building ready, and it was a Black church that leased the building to them for 100 years at $1. The playground was in the street. The church was divided into two sections, one for boys, one for girls. There was a potbelly stove in the middle, and the boys were responsible for keeping that stove going. You could bring your lunch, or you could go home for lunch. And these are stories we gathered from some of the people who attended that school. In 1924, some Black citizens petitioned the school board that we need better facilities for our children. And at that point, there was 183 children there, and they had to go to school in half-day segments because there was not enough room for everybody to be there at one time. So some black citizens did petition the school board for better facilities, and the result of that is the Douglas building on North Kent Street. It was opened in 1927, and the cost was, I believe it was $31,000, and that included the land, the building itself, and all the furnishings. The building was such an outstanding facility at that time that the school board came from Alexandria, Virginia. They wanted to see this building because they wanted to do one there after the design of this building. I think it was in 1942 that a new addition was added because at that time Douglas only went to the 7th grade. In 1942, they added 2 more rooms. The grades were increased to 9. In 1948, I believe, it went to 10, 1949 at 11, and then it was not until 1954 that the 12th grade graduating class came out of Douglas. So they had an addition in the early 40s, which was $4,000. There was an addition in the early 50s, which was $120,000. And in 1963, prior to closing the school, they did another addition, which was like $60,000. So that's the building. I believe it was in 1934. And I'm not going to get paid for quoting statistics, thank goodness, because I remember them, but not exactly sure the dates. But in 1934, Mr. Klein was superintendent of Frederick County Schools, and he approached Winchester if the blacks from Frederick County could come into Winchester for high school. They did not want to go to the expense of building high schools in the county. So there was an agreement reached. Later on, Shenandoah County also approached Winchester school system about sending their high school students into Winchester. They too did not have enough of a population to build high schools for blacks in their area. And so they started coming. So the 3 superintendents got together, went to the state, appealed to the state, and Douglas was declared a regional high school. Tuition was paid, I think it started at $40, and by the end, in 1963, it was like $325 per student. And the kids from Woodstock Strasburg, which is Shenandoah County, rode into Winchester starting early in the morning. They had buses that were old, no heat, and believe it or not, the drivers were students. I can't imagine this day and time allowing high school students to bring a busload of high school students 40 miles into Winchester. I mean, we can't even let our kids, the bus stops every block. But they were allowed to ride from Woodstock, Strasburg, and then Stevens City, Middletown, and the surrounding county into Winchester. And basically that stopped in, I believe it was 1963. The next chapter, I believe, talks a little bit about our teachers, our principals. Douglas was such a fun place to be, and I was there from 1st grade through 12th grade, so naturally I knew the same people over and over year after year. And some of us are still friends today because we started 1st grade together, probably live near each other, and still friends today. So that was one of the plus things. Our books came from Hanley, and they were really in bad shape sometimes. And you would get books with some messages that were unbelievable, but still we made the best of what was there. You just blocked it out, marked it out some kind of way, and went on. But we also had very much support from the white community. When Mr. Jasper came and formed the band and the Glee Club, when they wanted to go to the music festivals, the Lions Club, different clubs would help pay. Mr. Lowry Mr. Henry Lowry, that had Coca-Cola Company, he brought our first scoreboard for us. And so we were supported by the community, the entire community. I won't just say Winchester, I will say the entire community. We have a section that talks about student activities and use of the building, the recreation, department, Winchester's recreation department, also used the Douglas building and the Douglas grounds as a recreation area for brown children, black children. They had flower shows, all different kinds of things. Clark County blacks also used Douglas for something large that they were having and didn't have facilities in Clark County. So we talked a little bit about the use of the building, and it was very popular. I can remember graduations, and the auditorium was crowded, and they would just open the door and put chairs out on the line. That's how many people came to support graduation at Douglas. It was just, like I said, really a fun place to be. I'm going to start reading a little bit about some of the things going on. Two seniors at Douglas, Tanya Cartwright and Harriet Washington, gave detailed reports of Booker T. Washington Girls States held in Richmond in July to members of the Conrad Hoover Unit Number 21 American Legion Auxiliary. Ms. Cartwright and Ms. Washington told the instruction and government they received and expressed their thanks to the Ladies Auxiliary for sending them. The Douglas Band participated in the Northern Regional Band Festival in Warrenton on Saturday. The band was just organized this year and is very proud of the 2+ rating that they received. The Glee Club will go to Charlottesville March the 28th to the Northern Regional Music Festival. So those were just, the band and Glee Club were always outstanding. Mr. Jasper came in the early 50s, early to mid-50s, formed the Glee Club. Then he formed a band. The first uniforms of the band were white pants, white shirt, and blue boleros. And the ladies in the community made the boleros for us. And then when Mr. Jasper went to the school board to ask them to finish purchasing uniforms for the band, the black community had already raised 1/2 of the cost of the uniform. And then in 1963, among 147 high school students to participate in the All-State Band Festival at Virginia State College in March, 11 students were from Douglas. I mean, we just did outstanding with what we were given. We turned lemons into lemonade. Probably had a lot of sugar in it. We had outstanding sports programs under Mr. Barksdale, who came in the early 50s. The state champions, we won state champions in 1953 and 1954. We were district champions in 1959, 1960, 1961, and 1962. We had undefeated teams in 1953 and 1959. To show you the power, in 1961, in football, Douglas scored 393 points and only allowed 26. Yeah, we thought we were all that. In basketball, never had any undefeated seasons, but seasons like 14-7, that was 14 wins for Douglas, 7 lost. We scored 1,205, and our opponents 989. We were district champions for 10 straight years. We lost in 1960, so from 55 to 59, and then 61 to 65. We were regional winners 4 years, 57, 58, 59, and 62. And we were state runners-up in 1958 and 1962 when we lost in double overtime to Booker T. Washington. Score of the game was 46-45. The girls and JV junior varsity teams played their games before the varsity boys and were also coached by Ed Barksdale. The girls team averaged 3 games per year and was a total of 14-7, 14-1, 7 losses. Information on the JV games were not always reported to the Winchester Star, but they also had winning seasons. And then Mr. Barksdale also ran a Saturday morning midget league for young boys, and they were coached by the older boys. So he was getting his later teams prepared. There was one class that was really, really heavy as far as after graduation, and that was the class of 1918. Madison Briscoe was in that class, who later became a biologist and went to Africa to represent the U.S. government and study infectious diseases. Kurt Gaskins came back and was our final principal at Douglas, and Taylor Finley also was part of that class and came back as a dentist, Dr. Finley, who had a dentist practice. He opened the recreation center on Kent Street. He taught at Douglas for a bit, and then he was one of the founders of the Douglas Alumni Association. As far as classwork, a lot of the students were entered in, like the home ec teacher entered her students in the Pillsbury contest, the McCall's pattern contest, anything they could find that they could enter their students, so we knew how we measured up against other students around the country. And that was always fun. In bookkeeping and shorthand, our teacher purchased tests. And in accounting, we had to keep the books for 6 months for a company. And they were sent away, and they were graded by the company, not by our teacher, but they were graded by the company. So we always kind of knew where we compared to other students around the world. The Glee Club in the early 50s was under a Mrs. Turner. She was also a white music teacher for Hanley. But I've heard tales that I've heard stories. I won't say tales yet. But I've heard that they did recording. Never seen it, never heard. But some people who were part of that Glee Club do remember. They remember who the soloist was for the recording. But the Glee Club under Mrs. Turner sang before the Exchange Club, the Civic League. She took them to the VA Center in Martinsburg, the Lions Club. So they did their community service. They were invited to a lot of the local organizations to perform during their probably meetings. But it was a very, very fun place to be. It was fun to be in classes. It was fun to be in the extracurricular activity. And it was wide open. You could be in the band, play basketball, and do all the things you wanted to do because we had such a limited. As I was looking today, I think the largest enrollment in any given year was 305. And that was from 1st through 12th grade and included Frederick County and Shenandoah County high school students. So we weren't very big, but we were powerful. Now I'll talk a little bit about the 2 S's versus the 1 S, which we had that controversy a bit ago. But in searching school board records and all of the Douglas literature, we only found 2 instances that it was referred to with 2 S's. Now, some people say that we played at Douglas and Leesburg, and to distinguish, they had 2 and we had 1. Other people have said that Douglas-Leesburg bills came to us and vice versa and so, but there's no really, we really couldn't find and became known as Douglas when Professor Gibson came in 1916. But as far as looking at the school board minutes, we never found where he actually made a proposal to name it this, and they voted on it and said this is what it is. We never found anything like that. But it was just a magical time for us, and Sandra is here, who's a product of Douglas also, that she can probably vouch. Some of the magic times were junior, senior prom, graduation night. Not only was the doors open in the crowd, but they also had open house in the gym, and all of the young men who made projects in industrial arts and the young ladies who made projects in home economics was on display. Anybody could come in to look at them. We did plays every Friday as part of the Douglas program. Each class was responsible for putting on an assembly program. And Mr. Gaskins, who was June's father, would play the piano. We would march in 1st grade, 1st, 12th grade last, And then in going out, the 12th grade went first, and the first graders were like, but the teacher in her class was responsible for putting on some sort of assembly. It could be a play, whatever. Declamation contests were very big, and in the 1920s, they had a regional contest at Stewart College in Harpers Ferry, and a young lady from here, Sandra's aunt, won the contest and brought the trophy home. But students from Douglas participated in the Elks Declamation contest and went to Alexandria or Fairfax or wherever the district, if they won here, they went to district. Some of them even went on to participate in the state Elks contest. So they pretty much groomed us and trained us to be the best we could be. And as I said, the books weren't always the best, but we made lemonade out of it. And then here's an ad. This young lady was scored on the Betty Crocker Homemaker test. That was part of the search for Miss Homemaker of Tomorrow. She scored the highest test in Douglas, and so she was in the state and then in the national competition. So for being a small school on that end of town, we did a lot with what we had. I'm proud to say that I came from Douglas. Let me talk a little bit about homecoming. Our homecoming was not like the ones we know now. We had to raise money. Each class had selected a young lady to represent them. And so for like 2 months, maybe, you did whatever you could. You would have a social, sell dinners, we had waistline parties. If you don't know, that measured your waist, and that's how much you paid to get in. We had sock hops. We did a lot of things to raise money. And at the end, whichever class had raised the most money, that's who became the homecoming queen. And we had the big ceremony, and we were crowned and so forth. But that money was used to pay for transportation to the different sports activities, sports games, and whatever else the sports teams needed. Now, our basketball teams in the 50s, basketball and football, went as far as Rockville, Maryland, Cumberland, Maryland, Hagerstown. There was not a lot of schools in our area, and so Mr. Barksdale took them far away. Well, by that standard, it was far away, but now we can go in an hour or two. But that's how far they went away to play, and then they had tri-state tournaments. One was held here at the Armory in Winchester, and some of the articles talked about some nights there was like 500 spectators there. I don't know how they got in the Armory, but anyhow. It was just such a big part of school life. But that's how we had homecoming queen. We weren't voted on. That's so our chicken dinner. Sandra, anything else you can think of?
Well, the only thing I could say is that some of my fondest memories of being at Douglas are being in the Glee Club, because I love to sing. And when Mr. Jasper was there, we had a wonderful marching band. We had a jazz band. I learned to play saxophone. And there were just so many things that we learned to do. We were in industrial arts where we worked with wood, and was in home economics where we learned to sew and to cook. And there are just a lot of fond memories from our school days when we learned so much that wasn't actually in the textbook. But just some great experiences. Thank you, Judy.
Mm-hmm. And then another thing, our teachers either lived in the community 3 or 4 houses down from you, or you went to the same church with them. And so we really became very, very close-knit. School is a special place, and don't let a report come home that you didn't do right in school, because there were 2 places you could not mess up. One was church and the other was school. But having our teachers in our community really made a difference, because you got to see them other than in school. You got to see them in churches, participating in activities in churches. Some of them even taught Sunday school or played piano for our churches. So you really learned, and they learned you. I'm done. We've got some time for some question and answer if you have any.
What was the last graduating class?
1966.
66.
Mm-hmm. And then it became Winchester Intermediate.
Okay.
86.
So it was used as a middle program for a number of years before.
For a number of years. Okay.
When the classroom, how it was integrated, how were your students perceived in Hanley? Was there a lot of controversial, was there a lot of negative stuff?
I was not there, but from my understanding of some people that were there, it was quietly. There was no, at the beginning, there were no big demonstrations, no big controversy, but one girl said that the day she went, her grandfather drove her. And she said all the windows are open and you could hear, here they come. But as far as the name calling, being nasty to you and all that, it was more quiet-like.
When you went into class and you were assigned a seat, maybe beside somebody who was white, for instance, was there any kind of, oh, I don't want to sit beside her thing?
I've never heard that. I think it was more insinuated, but not said. From what and that's not part of this book. But integration some parents, I think early in maybe the 1960s, applied for kids to go to Hanley. And the rule of thumb was you had to live within so many feet of Hanley. Well, these kids lived out in North Loudon. So they measured how many steps they were from Hanley. And that was one ploy they used. So when these parents didn't win because they had younger children, they went right back with the younger children. And finally the state said, no, you will accept these children and you need to have a plan in place. Well, the school board decided that they would do one grade a year. So it would have probably been in the 80s by the time they got all the classes done. And the state came back and said, no, it will not work that way either. You have to come up with a better plan. And so integration went on. But from my talking to some of the first students, it was quiet. They kind of let you know, even without talking to you, that they didn't want you there. But I didn't experience that. I graduated in 65. Yeah, so I missed all that. Barbara?
Well, Judy, we've known each other a long time. We moved here in 1970, and our daughter was 3, and she started John Kerr in the first grade. And that's when they rezoned, and we were going Frederick Douglass. And interesting enough, all of a sudden, the population at Sacred Heart increased, as you can imagine. But my neighbor and I decided that we were going to see how this could all work out. And Scott started there in first grade. They both graduated from Frederick Douglass, and they had a wonderful education there. We had good teachers, and they liked the neighborhood. I mean, they rode the bus through the neighborhood, and they, met people there. I remember one afternoon Jim forgot to pick up Scott from his trumpet lesson over at Virginia Avenue. So he walked the bus route back to Frederick Douglass so he could get back to our house on Piccadilly Street. And I said, well, Scott, were you afraid? I didn't mean threaten, but I just meant because he was alone. He said, Mom, I knew everybody. I thought, that's what we wanted. So that's great. But I do have a question. I see a Dr. Floyd Finley's picture in here. Now, would he have been the father of the Floyd Finley that was on the school board and lived in that community, and I just learned to love? And there's a tree planted in his honor in front of the school over there.
No, that's Dr. Taylor Floyd. Okay, and he was the dentist. He and Floyd
But
was.
his last name is Finley.
Finley.
Mm-hmm. He was, but they weren't related.
They were related, but he was not Floyd's dad.
Oh,
I don't know, Sandra, how are they related? Because Sandra was a Finley, or is a Finley.
I'm still a Finley. Dr. Finley's father and Floyd, the one that you know, his grandfather they were brothers.
Oh,
That's
okay.
how they were related.
I just was very close to Floyd and just really was so fond of him, and I still drive by to see if this tree is doing okay.
When I walk, I check on it.
Good.
And speaking of the community being accepted and knowing everybody, the students who rode into Winchester from Shenandoah County or from Frederick County, when they wanted to stay for activities such as evening football games, parents of the students took them in. If you were my friend, I was welcome to bring you home so that you could spend the night and participate. So we've always been kind of that loving, open, accepting community. Thanks, Barbara, for bringing that. And Barbara and I served on the PTO together.
That's right.
Many years. She's 37 and I'm 39. So. And Mary and I served on the school board together.
And I remember the 2S discussion when it became the Douglas Learning Center.
Yes.
And we talked then, should we change the spelling and put the 2 S's in? And I looked at you, and you said, no, keep the 1 S, because that was the tradition.
Yes, right. I mean, all of our diplomas and everything, it's only 1 S.
Yeah.
We've only found 2 instances where it was 2. And so, you stay with what's there. Don't try to change it in midstream or after the fact.
Right.
What's it?
How much did, were the older children kind of either voluntarily or asked to help along the younger children? Either formally, as you mentioned that in some cases older students were coaches of the younger kids in athletics, but were there any other instances where they were kind of given that responsibility?
Every once in a while, but not a lot. A teacher may have to leave for a doctor's appointment or something, and she would ask Mr. Gaskins, who was our principal then, to bring one of the seniors over maybe to watch her class for an hour or two. But we didn't have a lot of that. Not a lot. Mr. Bennett?
Yes, I just want to know, how about the size of the classes were? I can see that the numbers were small as far as schools are concerned, but what about the classroom size?
I don't think we ever had more than 20 in a class. And Mr. Barksdale was our football coach, basketball coach, girls basketball coach, boys basketball coach, little league director. But he also taught biology. He had 3 biology classes. He taught physical education. He played city league basketball. But he was probably one of our strongest role models. Mr. Gaskins' punishment was write sentences. Mr. Barksdale's punishment was run laps until you just couldn't run no more, until you just fell off. And he was a coach who took such interest in his players. I mean, the night before game, around 9 o'clock, when you were out in the street, you knew to start watching, because any minute he was going to come riding by, put that window down and say, get home. But we didn't have big classes at all. Probably about 20 was the biggest.
Was there any corporal punishment? As you know, even looking back further in history.
Yes. From what I've been told, I've not experienced this, but one of the custodians, Mr. Denby, had a paddle. And if boys got too out of range, he could take you in the basement where the boilers were, and he could give you a couple whacks with them. And we had a couple of students. Miss Moten was one. Her father was Professor Gibson, and they had a habit of taking a ruler and just cracking their knuckles. The greatest punishment was probably taking cod liver oil every day. We had to take cod liver oil every day, probably until you got into the higher elementary grades. You were allowed to bring an orange or something. Now, it couldn't be candy, but you were allowed to bring an orange or something to go afterward. But we had to take cod liver oil. And And it's amazing because Reverend Quiet was a principal at one time. His daughter, Anna Tokus, became a teacher, and her son, Dr. Brooks, also became a teacher. Professor Gibson's daughter, Blanche, became a teacher, and then her daughter, Loretta, worked in the school office. So there were some generational things that went on there, too. Generation after generation worked for the schools.
Judy, I have a question for you.
Okay.
I remember my big thing when I went to Douglas, this was in the 80s, so it was just the elementary school at that point. But the big thing that we always looked forward to was Black History Month, where we would each have like a little biography and we would dress up, you know, as this famous Black historical figure. When did that start? Do you know?
I think Helen Davenport, maybe.
That was
that
kind
your
of what
teacher?
I didn't have her. I had Mrs. Ramsey, but I remember her very well.
I think that might have happened, and Barbara, you can correct me. I think
So
that might have happened under their.
Okay.
But now, when we were going to school, we knew nothing about Black history. We were not taught Black history. We really didn't. You know, I mean, some of the stories from Winchester. There was a family here. One of the most amazing stories to me. There was a family here, and their last name was Brown, and they had 5 or 6 children, and they all left here and either became doctors or pharmacists. The one daughter was the first woman to sit on the board of trustees at Howard University. I never heard this story growing up, but as you got older and you start digging, you learn these things, but we were never told these type stories as kids to encourage us or to say, you know, so-and-so did this, you can do this. We never heard those type stories.
I'm sure as you were talking, something's resonating in my mind. A couple of years ago, I went to Martinsburg, and there's a school, a former Black school there. Was it Raymond or Raymond? I think you mentioned to me.
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, when I was up there, they had a room set aside for the history of African Americans in the area. And I was wondering, possibly we could do something here, you know, with the Douglas School. You know, there's so much history here and what you've done with your book. Is that something that would come through the school board?
Every year as part of the Douglas Alumni Association's weekend, they do meet and greet up at the old school. And the superintendent was there this year talking about renovating that building and using it for the administrative complex. And that's one of the things he talked about, is hopefully in working with the designers and all, that there will be some way that some of that history and those pictures can be incorporated in that building. So, you know, they promised to work with people in the community when the time comes, once they get approval to move forward, to hopefully some of that will be done. Yes, sir?
Judy, I'm working out with one who came here.
I knew your face, but I'm thinking.
I read your book, and it's just wonderful. And, my father grew up on North Camden Street, and he used to walk across the tracks over to Douglas School in Mr. Barksdale, and he was in Hanley. But our hope is, and it's just a dream right now, is that we can. It's really the youth we would like to see. Of course, there's some obstacles, Boys and Girls Club and Head Start, but we would love to turn it into our administrative office, because we think it would be investing back in the community, and we think that it would bring traffic into the north end of the city. And so part of it would be to turn the entire building into a living museum, and the entire decor would be dedicated to the history of Douglas, and it's a great concept. And y'all have so much memorabilia there at the reunion a month ago. I guess part of the challenge is you know, I think the last year was 1965. I mean, sooner or later you're going to run out of alumni.
Yes.
And I mean, time is of the essence. And the building right now, the reality of the building is limping along, and it's got to have work done to it. just a few minutes, I want to meet with the architect and just trying to figure out how we go with this. We think we have a good, best concept when we come up with the school, but we would love to see the entire building, like the piano that Mr. Gaskins had, and put it right back where it was, and decorated that place.
The other thing we talk about in the book is the Alumni Association, and they do have a weekend meeting every year, but they have since maybe 1977, something like that, they've given over $85,000 back to young people going to college who either who their parents or somebody in their family have to have a connection to Douglas. And so they give it Hanley, James, all the 4 county schools, and even in Strasburg and Woodstock in honor of Douglas. So there is a good that comes out of the Alumni Association that they are raising money to give back and to keep that spirit of Douglas and giving alive.
Could I just tell a funny story? Well, it seems funny, but when my brother was a senior at Douglas, well, my mother graduated from Douglas as well, but my brother was a senior, and one day the senior class decided they were going to leave school. So my brother stole the school bus and loaded up the seniors, and they all went to my mother's house. And she asked them if they had permission, and they all said yes. And then it wasn't too long before the phone rang, and it was Mr. Gaskins. Are my seniors over there at your house? And did they take the school bus? And she said, yes, sir, they'll be right back.
Hey, you would expel them from school.
In my senior class, we did a senior skip day, but we knew we had to be back in time for commencement practice. And Miss Effie Davis was our advisor, and you just didn't. And so their music is playing, and they marching, we just walking in front of the I'm so glad we all gone.
Has the community around the school changed much? Because I remember Floyd Finley and visiting him at his house, and he could name every neighbor, that had been there for years and years. Is that changed?
It's changing a lot, Barbara, because a lot of the older people are gone now. Right. Some of the young people coming in are good. Some of them are not so good. When we were on the school board, when Mary and I were on the school board, I think during the time that building sat empty for I don't know how many years, only once was there any vandalism and one window was broken. So that building is still sacred to that community. But the community is changing. It's changing, some good, some bad. And I can tell this story. I left my pocketbook on my front porch one night.
Nobody touched it.
Nobody touched it. It was still on that chair on my front porch, and I got up the next morning and just walked out the door, and there it was. Nobody touched it. So in that way, it's still, and one day I was home from work, and I happened to be in the shower, and when I came out to come down the steps, my neighbor was coming up, and she said, I knocked on the door, and you never answered, and I knew you were in here, and I came in and I hollered, and I knew you had to be here. And so she was coming upstairs to check on me, and she said, I don't know what I would have done if I found you laid out someplace, but I mean, that's still the concept of the neighborhood. We check on our neighbors. So that's a good thing.
Good.
Any other questions? Thank you.